Tales of the Jedi: The Fall of the Sith Empire is the second volume in a two-part story that takes place 1,000 years before the events of Knights of the Old Republic and the rest of the Tales series, and 5,000 years before the events of A New Hope. It almost has the exact same creative team as the previous volume, and it shows because everything matches up with the first book nearly perfectly. I have to say, the biggest improvement over the previous volume was the pacing, because in The Fall of the Sith Empire, the pacing was excellent. Because it's really the second half of one story, this is the ending of what started in Golden Age of the Sith, and as such, there's a lot more action in it. The pacing at the beginning pretty much matches the previous story, but when the Sith Empire finally attacks the Republic, all hell breaks loose and everything speeds up. In a single issue, we have the Sith Empire attacking the Republic on about 4 separate planets at once, Oden giving Jory Darrigan a lightsaber, and Jory and Gav facing off against each other, all in one issue. I much preferred the pacing in this to Golden Age of the Sith, but I understand that since Golden Age of the Sith went back further than anything ever had in the Legends timeline, it had to take a bit of time to set things up and introduce the reader to a new, older, lower tech and undeveloped version of the Star Wars universe. These two stories were released after the other main Tales of the Jedi comics that focused on Nomi Sunrider, Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma, but even though we'd already been introduced to an older version of the Star Wars universe in those books, since Golden Age of the Sith and The Fall of the Sith Empire take place 1,000 years before the Knights of the Old Republic graphic novel, not to be confused with the games that focused on Revan and Mitra Surik, or the series of comics with the same name that focused on Zane Carrick, taking the time to set up the state of the galaxy in the first book was a good idea in my opinion. Kevin J. Anderson has used that to his advantage though, because by having Gavin Jory's stories take place outside of the Republic in the first volume, it allowed him to explore the state of the Republic as a side story, then bring the two together at the end, which set up this book. I think that was a good way to go about it, and he planned it well because it means Fall of the Sith Empire doesn't waste any time. It had the perfect springboard set up at the end of Golden Age of the Sith, so things can afford to go much quicker in it without risk of losing the reader because they don't understand the setup. Following on from the events of the previous book, we see Gav Darrigon in his training with Naga Sadow. Well, not actually training, more like just doing things Naga Sadow tells him to do, then being distracted by pretty gems. While it would have been cool to see him in his actual training, having Naga Sadow keeping him busy was actually not a bad idea at all, because it means Gav Darrigon doesn't have time to think, and if he can't think, he can't spew shit from his face hole like he did in the last volume. He's still an inconsistent character though, because every time he has the option to act alone in this book, he once again acts without thinking. Sure, at the end he made a decision that was quite probably the only good decision he ever made in his life, but before that, he's just weird. It's like Kevin J. Anderson just didn't know what to do with his personality. One example of this is him attacking his sister with his lightsaber, then asking her why she doesn't want to talk to him. It's just too inconsistent for my tastes. Jory, on the other hand, was totally consistent, as were the rest of the supporting cast. Everyone acted with the same personalities and convictions as they did in the previous book, so once again it's a case of Gav spouting shit and the rest of the other characters having to carry the book. But fortunately, they were written well enough so that once again they can actually do it. The story itself is pretty good, with Naga Sadow attempting to invade the Republic and Empress Tita and her band of merry men fighting off the invasion while also trying to convince the rest of the Republic to help. It didn't really have the most depth because it was all set up in Golden Age of the Sith and it didn't need it. Instead, the story focused on wrapping up all the loose ends from the last book, and the whole team did a good job with it. The plots were satisfying, the battles were interesting, especially with the way the tides constantly turned, so I never knew exactly how something was going to play out, and everything was resolved in a way I was happy with. At one point during the Sith's invasion, one of the Jedi shouts that the Jedi have protected the Republic for 100 generations, but that doesn't really match up with Golden Age of the Sith, which made it clear that the Republic was new at the time. How long is a generation? No one can agree, but if you take it to be from your birth to the birth of your first child, I think most people would consider the length of a generation to be 20 to 30 years. If you average that out to 25, then multiply it by the claimed 100 generations, then the Jedi have been protected in the Republic for 2,500 years. That is not a republic that's just formed, it's one that's been around for a while. When you think about it, it's longer than the Republic lasted in the prequel trilogy. From Darth Bane's creation of the Rule of Two to the Phantom Menace was 1,000 years. We know that's a fact in the Legends timeline, but these Jedi have been protecting the fledgling Republic for 2.5 times that. To be honest, I expected better of Kevin J. Anderson. He's not the sort of author to mess up on lore like that, so perhaps it was meant to say 10 generations. I can't really comment on if it was or wasn't, only on what's printed, and what's printed doesn't match up with the previous story in the arc, which was also written by Kevin J. Anderson. The art was the same as the previous book, with Dario Carrasco Jr. doing the pencils, but one difference was the fact that Ray Murtaugh did the colouring. He didn't work on the previous book, but you'd never know it because the colours look exactly the same, so he did a good job there. I didn't realise when I reviewed Golden Age of the Sith, but for some reason, both of these books had 4 inkers, and I can't imagine why they would need that many. It doesn't hurt the book in any way, it just seems weird. But the art in this book was on par with the previous book, and everything looked equally as good, and that ancient Egyptian styling still looks really good. The book has a pretty unique format in that it has a square cutout in the front cover, so that title you see on the front cover is actually on the first page of the book. You wouldn't know from looking at a picture, but it's actually pretty cool to see in real life. I have to admit the cutout did catch a few times when I put the book back on a shelf, because as the book slid in, the corner of another book would find its way into that cutout and catch it, but it's not a big deal and it never damaged the book. The back of the book has the same layout as Golden Age of the Sith, with bare bones extras like a few bits of concept art sparsely spread out over a couple of pages, but something that I did like was the fold out image of all the covers. The cover of each of the 5 issues of the Fall of Sith Empire is actually just one section of a larger piece of art, and the back of the book has a fold out image of the Pentaptic in its entirety on one piece of paper. It looks really nice, and while it's a nice inclusion, it would have been awesome if they'd given the Pentaptic the same dimensions as the rest of the pages, but unfortunately it's about 3/4 of the size, which is a shame because I would have loved to have seen the full art in its full size. It's a shame, but it is still a very cool inclusion. So overall, The Fall of the Sith Empire was a pretty good read. In spite of Gav Daragon's stupidity, I still thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I think it's an excellent sequel to Golden Age of the Sith, and both the story and the artwork are equally as good as in the previous volume. If you've read Golden Age of the Sith, I thoroughly recommend reading this because it wraps everything up, and if you haven't, I absolutely recommend that you do read it, then read Fall of the Sith Empire, because as a duology, they're actually really enjoyable comics.